Crockett, the angry one from Texas, the moment she walked into the hearing. But just minutes later, Bondi found herself cornered by her own past as Crockett turned the chamber into a courtroom. Lawmakers were stunned into silence, and Bondi's reputation began to collapse. How did one woman turn an insult into the most terrifying moment in Washington? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The Capitol hearing room was built for history, but today it struggled to hold something sharper. Tension. Mahogany benches lined with press badges, the air heavy with rehearsed lines and silent standoffs. Camera lights burned like spotlights at a trial no one dared name. Pam Bondi had arrived early. She always did. Seated confidently at the witness table in a crisp ivory suit, she looked every inch the seasoned insider. Shoulders square, legs crossed, expression relaxed but calculating. Cameras caught her exchanging polite smiles with committee members, even cracking a soft laugh at some off-mic comment. She owned the room until the door behind the chamber creaked open. The moment Jasmine Crockett entered, something shifted. No dramatic entrance, no entourage, just her and the silence that followed. Jasmine walked with the kind of composure that came not from confidence, but from necessity. Chin level, gaze forward, spine straight like armor. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't softening herself for the room. That, in itself, was its own rebellion. Her heels clicked on the stone floor, louder than they should have. Not from volume, but from how intently the room listened. And then, just as she reached the aisle between rows of polished oak benches, Pam Bondi leaned slightly forward, her voice low, but unmistakably clear. Just loud enough for the front row and, fatefully, a live mic to catch. "Here comes the angry one from Texas." The words cut cleaner than any insult. Casual, clinical, deliberate. No raised tone, no performative sarcasm, just enough venom to let everyone know it wasn't a joke. Jasmine heard it. She didn't stop, didn't look, but the camera, always watching, caught the flicker. Her right hand tightened into a controlled fist for a heartbeat before releasing. That was it. No rebuttal, no pause in her stride. But in that tiny movement was everything: history, fury, and restraint. Pam leaned back with the faintest smirk, satisfied. But what she didn't realize was this. She hadn't branded Jasmine with that name. She had just given her the opening. And Jasmine Crockett didn't waste openings. The insult had already been delivered, but now came the performance, dressed in calm, laced with intent, and aimed with precision. Pam Bondi adjusted her microphone with deliberate care, the kind of slow, rehearsed motion that signaled control, not nerves. Her hands didn't tremble. Her voice didn't waver. In fact, everything about her, posture, tone, cadence, had the quiet, weaponized polish of someone who had spent years behind podiums, under lights, and in front of cameras. This was her arena, and she knew it. She looked up at the committee members with a practiced smile that never quite reached her eyes and began. "Some," she said, her tone calm and conversational, "prefer to shout rather than reason." She let the words hang in the air, not rushed, not hesitant, just long enough for the implication to settle. Not a single head turned, but everyone heard the shift. Her tone remained composed, even warm, as if she were simply making a general observation, not planting a precise, premeditated strike. And yet everyone in that room knew exactly who she was talking about. She continued, eyes focused squarely ahead, but with the faintest glances drifting toward the witness table across from her. "Emotion doesn't equate to intellect," she said next. The phrasing was surgical, sharpened by decades of experience. It wasn't just what she said, it was how. Every sentence floated out like an olive branch, but carried the edge of a blade. It was all plausible. It was all technically polite. And yet, each phrase cut deeper than if she'd simply pointed a finger. She didn't need to mention Jasmine's name. She didn't need to say the angry one from Texas. The room already knew the subtext, and that made it worse. Worse because it was intentional. Worse because it was delivered with a smile. Worse because it was designed to provoke without ever appearing aggressive. Pam Bondi leaned slightly to one side, her fingers interlaced on the table. The picture of composure. Passion, she added with a small tilt of her head, must be tempered by patriotism. Again, her voice stayed level, but the choice of words did the heavy lifting. In this version of the story, she was the voice of reason. Jasmine, by implication, was the storm. Bondi wasn't calling her out directly. She was pushing her into a narrative corner, daring her to react, to prove the caricature right. The silence in the chamber had thickened. Nobody gasped. Nobody objected. But you could feel it, how the temperature had dropped half a degree, how the air moved differently. Some committee members shifted in their chairs. One aide scribbled a note, then paused midway. Two representatives on opposite sides of the aisle exchanged a glance that said, wordlessly, "Did she really just say that?" Jasmine sat still, expression unreadable, not giving Bondi the satisfaction of a visible reaction. But the camera was still rolling, catching everything. The way Bondi's eyes flickered to Jasmine every few lines. Not quite directly, but deliberately enough. The way her voice softened just slightly whenever her remarks danced closest to the line. It was the kind of attack that couldn't be objected to because it never fully declared itself. It was politics at its most refined and its most poisonous. Bondi hadn't come to argue a point. She had come to plant doubt, to make the room wonder whether Jasmine Crockett was too loud, too emotional, too much. And she was doing it under the banner of reason, under the mask of civility. She finished her remarks and sat back slightly, letting the moment breathe. The silence was longer this time, not awkward, but watchful, because even those who agreed with Bondi knew something had just shifted. Something quiet, something hard to name, but real. And Jasmine hadn't even spoken yet. The room was still holding its breath when Jasmine finally rose, not to defend herself, but to reclaim the ground beneath her feet. She didn't reach for notes. She didn't glance at an aide. There was no stack of papers, no whisper in her ear, no dramatic flourish. Just Jasmine Crockett, standing slowly, deliberately, with both hands resting lightly on the table. The chair scraped softly against the marble floor, the only sound in a chamber that had gone deathly quiet. Her eyes swept across the room, not confrontational, not cold, but steady, like someone who had nothing left to prove and nothing left to fear. Then she spoke, and her voice was low, even, unwavering. "I didn't know I was angry until this room told me I should be." No one moved. No one dared. She didn't shout. She didn't raise her hand or her voice. But the authority in her tone cracked through the air like a lightning strike without thunder. It wasn't performative, it was precise. She wasn't here to explode. She was here to expose. And with that single sentence, she shattered the narrative that had been carefully built around her all morning. Not with rage, but with clarity. Not with volume, but with truth. Jasmine let the silence linger, holding the pause like a blade just before the cut. Then she took a step forward, not toward Pam Bondi, but toward the microphone, toward the record, the transcript, the history being written in real time. Her hands remained at her sides. Her voice didn't rise, but each word hit like it had been carved from stone. Every time I've questioned power, I've been called emotional. Every time I've raised my voice for someone who couldn't, I've been called aggressive. And now when I sit silent, I'm labeled angry. Eyes shifted in the room. A few members dropped their gaze. One reporter's pen stopped mid-sentence. She wasn't just speaking to Bondi anymore. She was speaking to the pattern, to the system, to the unspoken rules written between the lines of respectability. And she was tearing those lines down, one syllable at a time. She leaned slightly into the mic, not for volume, but for precision. "You don't get to decide what my tone means. You don't get to twist my presence into a threat. And you certainly don't get to paint my restraint as a failure to be polite." She turned her head, slowly, to glance at the faces staring back. Some frozen, some wide-eyed, some pretending to read documents they hadn't touched in 10 minutes. Her presence filled the space, not because she demanded it, but because it had been denied to her one too many times. There was no fire in her delivery, only fuel. And beneath it, something even more powerful than outrage: control. That was what made them uncomfortable. Not her passion, not her words, but the fact that she was speaking at all, without apology, without permission, and without needing to raise her voice to make them feel the impact. She could have stopped there and let the silence do the work. But Jasmine Crockett had carried these labels for too long to leave them unchallenged now. She stood fully upright now, voice steady, gaze locked on no one and everyone at once. "Do you know how many times I've been called emotional for simply disagreeing?" she asked. Not to the room, but to the air, to the record, to every corridor where that word had been whispered like a verdict. "How many times I've been told I'm too reactive, too intense, too difficult to manage, all because I refused to nod along?" Her voice didn't rise, but the words carried weight, falling into the room like bricks on marble. She listed them out slowly, one by one, like exhibits in a case. Emotional, unstable, disruptive, aggressive. Each label delivered with a pause, enough for the room to feel the sting, not just hear it. "I've been accused of being too loud in rooms that never wanted to hear me in the first place," she continued, her voice low, deliberate, unwavering. "I've been told I'm divisive for saying what others are praised for thinking. And I've been warned, that if I keep raising my voice, I'll lose credibility, as if silence is the price of legitimacy." Heads began to tilt down. A few pens stopped moving. Even some on Bondi's side of the aisle were shifting, as if the air itself had turned heavier. Jasmine wasn't just listing grievances. She was pulling open the drawer where the double standards lived and naming them, one by one. Then came the pivot. The moment the temperature dropped by degrees, she turned, not quickly, not with drama, but with purpose, and looked directly at Pam Bondi for the first time. Her tone didn't change. It didn't need to. "You," she said, voice even, "don't get to label my truth as anger." She took one small step forward, eyes locked. "And then call your own fear patriotism." The chamber froze. It wasn't loud. It wasn't shouted. But it was final. It was the kind of line that echoed even after it was spoken, like a door slammed in slow motion. Bondi didn't blink, didn't smile, but the cameras caught her jaw tighten, barely. Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't elaborate. She didn't apologize. She let the truth settle exactly where it landed. Undeniable, unshakable, and finally undeniable. The room was still recovering from the blow Jasmine had just delivered, but she wasn't finished. She hadn't come here to trade words. She had come armed with receipts. Without breaking eye contact, Jasmine reached down, tapped a single button on the tablet in front of her, and turned slightly to the chairwoman. "With permission, Madam Chair, I'd like to enter several items into the record." The chair nodded, slow and measured, as the screen behind Jasmine flickered to life. It wasn't dramatics. It wasn't theater. It was evidence. And the moment the first video began to play, the shift in the room was immediate, subtle, but unmistakable. Gone was the buzz of political posturing. Gone were the smirks, the scribbles, the whispered reactions. Now it was stillness, focus. The footage was grainy, from a courtroom security feed dated 2 years earlier. In it, a young black man stood trembling in an orange jumpsuit as a judge read out his sentence. 20 years for a crime later proven he didn't commit. There was no outrage in the room, only silence, the kind that hides behind decorum while injustice passes through unnoticed. Jasmine narrated, calm and precise. This young man was convicted without proper representation. The public defender was given the file 36 hours before trial. The prosecution withheld key evidence that would have cleared him. "This happened on my watch, and I intervened." She clicked again. A second video began, this time brighter, clearer. A podium. Pam Bondi at a political rally 2 years earlier. Her voice rang through the chamber now, amplified not by power, but by playback. "She's more concerned with feelings than facts," Bondi had said, referring to Jasmine by position, not by name. But the context was undeniable. The quote cut through the air like a second insult layered over the first. And now it echoed back at her, on federal record, on camera, in front of the entire nation. Jasmine didn't look away. She didn't gloat. She let the moment settle, then continued, her voice now anchored in purpose. "This is the file from that case." She raised it slowly, showing the stamped legal document with the words "Conviction Vacated" printed in bold at the top. "This," she said, holding up another paper, "is the testimony from the district attorney's own office, admitting they withheld evidence." Then another. "This is the appellate court's opinion, unanimous reversal, citing prosecutorial misconduct." She laid them on the table one by one, like placing the bones of something that had long been buried, now dug up for everyone to see. The silence in the hearing room grew heavier with each page. There were no outbursts, just a quiet reckoning, the kind that doesn't make headlines right away, but rewrites them later. Reporters stopped typing. Several members leaned forward, unconsciously, as if drawn in by the weight of facts too heavy to ignore. Jasmine didn't need to plead for credibility. She documented it, and the subtext couldn't be missed. While Bondi had relied on character framing, Jasmine had brought the record. She looked directly at the committee now, her eyes steady, voice calm but sharpened to a point. "I've been told I care too much, that I get too involved, that I lead with emotion instead of analysis." She gestured toward the screen, still paused on Bondi's quote. "But I ask you this, if I didn't feel something, would this man still be behind bars? If I hadn't gotten involved, would the truth have ever mattered?" Her voice didn't tremble. It cut through the room like glass, clear, hard, and undeniable. Then at last she stepped back from the microphone. Not because she had run out of things to say, but because she knew what needed to be said had been said. No grand finale, just truth, laid bare and unflinching. She waited, letting the weight of it settle into the air like smoke after a controlled burn. And then softly, finally with more conviction than volume, she said, "Anger didn't bring me here. Injustice did." The words didn't echo. They rooted. They didn't demand applause. They demanded reflection. The camera didn't need to pan to Bondi. Her stillness spoke loud enough. And across the chamber, somewhere between the stillness and the slow exhale of the crowd, it became clear. The room had shifted, not toward rage, not toward sympathy, but toward truth. And Jasmine Crockett had done what few could. She made the truth louder than the insult. But even truth, when spoken plainly, demands its final breath. And Jasmine Crockett wasn't going to let someone else take it for her. She turned back to her seat, not with triumph, but with calm finality, as if placing the final piece of evidence in a trial that had already delivered its own verdict. She moved slowly, deliberately, as if making sure the silence had time to settle into the walls. Her chair gave the faintest creak as she sat, and the room, still stunned from the collision between fact and fury, seemed to lean in again. Then she leaned forward, adjusted the mic, and without theatrics, without raising her voice, she said, "So yes, I am the angry one from Texas." No one shifted. No one breathed. Her tone was measured, not defensive, not apologetic, like a woman reclaiming not just a name, but the right to feel. "And I intend to stay angry until justice no longer has to beg for a seat in this room." The sentence hit with no volume, but with crushing gravity. It didn't soar. It landed like a gavel. For a full 3 seconds, the room remained frozen, suspended between discomfort and revelation. No chair shuffled, no aide whispered. Even the hum of the light seemed to dim. It wasn't silence by accident. It was silence by force. Because in that moment, Jasmine wasn't speaking to the room anymore. She was speaking for everyone who'd never been allowed to sit in it, and it showed. Pam Bondi said nothing. Her hands were clasped tighter now, her jaw fixed. Even those who had once nodded along with Bondi's barbs now stared straight ahead, caught between their politics and their conscience. Then a chair moved. Software unassuming, but decisive. A Republican congressman, gray suit, red tie, veteran from a rural district in Georgia, stood up from his seat near the end of the row. He didn't speak, didn't clap. He just stood, looked at Jasmine, and gave a slow, deliberate nod. It wasn't an endorsement, it was acknowledgement. And in a room built to reward silence and punish defiance, that nod carried more weight than any headline that would follow. Jasmine didn't react. She didn't smile. She didn't bow. She simply met his eyes for a beat and then looked away. Because this wasn't about recognition. This wasn't about optics. It was about truth finding a crack in the marble and refusing to be sealed back up again. The nod had barely settled when the silence broke. Not with applause, not with approval, but with Pam Bondi refusing to let Jasmine's final words define the last word in the room. Pam Bondi leaned forward, her fingers adjusting the microphone with rigid precision, as if steadying herself for a final blow. Her face was composed, but there was something brittle in her poise now. An edge sharpened not by confidence, but by bruised control. Her voice came through the speakers, crisp and clipped. Let's not turn personal insecurity into public policy. A pause, sharp enough to sting. We're here for solutions, not self-promotion. The words didn't just cut, they provoked. The room stirred, murmurs flickering like sparks across rows of committee members and press. It wasn't the content. People had grown used to Bondi's insinuations. It was the tone, the choice to strike after Jasmine had laid down proof, precedent, and pain. This wasn't coded anymore. It wasn't veiled. Bondi had crossed into direct attack, and everyone knew it. Jasmine, still seated, didn't react. She didn't blink. Her expression didn't shift. But the silence around her seemed to harden in her defense. A Republican senator 3 rows back, older, stone-faced, with a reputation for rarely speaking in public hearings, placed his hand on the table. Then with 2 fingers, he tapped it 3 times. Deliberate, unmistakable, a signal, not of protest, not of alliance, but of warning. The kind passed between soldiers, not politicians. Pam didn't notice it, or perhaps chose not to. She was too busy loading her next line, unaware that the room was no longer following her lead. It was watching her unravel. She had tried to flip the spotlight back on Jasmine, but the spotlight wasn't moving. It was staying exactly where it belonged. The insult had been thrown like a final spear, but Jasmine didn't reach for armor. She reached for the record. Jasmine Crockett stood slowly, with the same deliberate grace she had carried into the room. No rush, no reaction, no fire in her eyes, only focus. She didn't glance at Bondi, didn't return the jab with one of her own. She simply turned toward the chairwoman with a clarity that made the tension in the room thicken like storm air. "Madam Chair," she said, her voice as calm as if she were asking for the floor on a minor procedural motion, "I'd like to submit several documents into the record." The chair nodded, hesitantly, almost reverently, and gestured for the clerk. Jasmine reached into the folder beside her and began laying out each page with quiet precision. She didn't wave them. She didn't read them. She simply placed them, like evidence at a crime scene. The first document was a copy of an independent investigative report, thick, stapled, stamped in blue ink at the top. It detailed how, in 2023, Bondi had attempted to intervene in the disciplinary hearing of an officer accused of excessive force against a black teenager in Jacksonville. Jasmine didn't speak. She didn't narrate the report, but the bolded sentence at the top of the summary, "Efforts to influence internal discipline processes were traced directly to the office of Attorney General Pamela Bondi," was visible to every camera in the room. Bondi shifted in her seat for the first time that morning. Just a flicker. A movement so slight that only the cameras and a few very attentive lawmakers caught it. Next came a printed email thread, time-stamped, authenticated. Jasmine handed it to the clerk without a word, but the subject line was already drawing gas. RE: response to representative. Morales appearance on CNN. The body of the email was blunt. Pam Bondi had typed it herself, months earlier, after being criticized by Representative Elena Morales on live television. The sentence that mattered wasn't highlighted, but it didn't need to be. Frankly, she comes off as unstable, too emotional to be taken seriously. Jasmine didn't even lift her eyes as the clerk read it silently and handed it back. She didn't need to say it. Bondi's own words were already doing the work. The room was silent, not out of respect, but because something had shifted. Power was moving. It wasn't loud. It wasn't obvious. But it was unmistakable. There was no yelling, no back and forth, no parliamentary maneuvering. Just facts, laid down like quiet detonations. Jasmine stood at the center of it all, not commanding attention, but refusing to shrink under its weight. She didn't embellish. She didn't editorialize. The silence around her became its own testimony, and in that moment, it was louder than any argument ever shouted across a chamber floor. Bondi sat motionless now, her earlier sharpness dulling under the pressure of her own record. She reached for her water, but didn't drink. Her jaw tightened, just slightly, but she didn't speak. She couldn't, because in a room designed to reward rhetoric, Jasmine had chosen something more devastating: restraint. And the silence? It wasn't passive, it wasn't neutral, it was deliberate, like the pause before a verdict or the breath before a floodlight snaps on. Members of the press glanced at one another, unsure whether to type, film, or simply stare. A few committee members leaned in, not to interrupt, but to listen more closely, because there was something unmistakably seismic happening here. It wasn't just the facts, it was the way they were delivered, with neither apology nor anger, only truth. Raw, unfurnished, and placed in front of a room that could no longer pretend not to see it. Jasmine turned back to the microphone, not to explain, but to finish what needed finishing. Her voice was softer than before, but far more dangerous. "These aren't claims," she said. "They're not interpretations. They're not feelings." She gestured to the stack of documents now logged into the official record. "They're facts, and they don't go away just because someone calls them inconvenient." She didn't elaborate. She didn't look around for validation. She didn't need to. The silence in the room had become a verdict, and she had let the evidence speak it. Pam Bondi had brought politics. Jasmine Crockett had brought the truth. And the difference between the two had never felt so stark, so public, or so irreversible. The documents had landed like strikes on stone, too factual to refute, too damning to ignore, and now all eyes turned to the one person who still hadn't answered for them. The chairwoman adjusted her glasses and looked directly at Bondi, the pause deliberate, almost ceremonial. "Ms. Bondi," she said clearly, "do you wish to respond to the materials just submitted into the record?" The question echoed through the chamber, cutting through the breathless silence left in Jasmine's wake. For a moment, Bondi didn't move. Her face, once composed and camera-ready, had shifted into something tighter. Lips drawn, chin lifted slightly higher than before, as though trying to maintain altitude in a room that was rapidly tilting beneath her. The microphone in front of her seemed to loom larger now, its red light blinking patiently, indifferent to the weight behind it. She opened her mouth, then closed it. A full 5 seconds passed, the kind of pause that screams louder than a denial. Then finally her voice emerged, smaller than before, stripped of its earlier edge. "I don't recall those emails," she said. No embellishment, no explanation. Just that. Flat, incomplete, almost mechanical, a defense too rehearsed to sound sincere and far too short to cover the damage done. She didn't lift her eyes as she spoke it, didn't clarify, didn't challenge the documents themselves. She simply leaned back, as if the statement were enough to create distance from her own words. It wasn't. The room reacted before the chair could, the kind of reaction no one plans for, but everyone feels. A low murmur, controlled but unmistakable, began to ripple through the committee. Not outrage, not disbelief, something colder: calculation. One lawmaker near the center shifted forward, his lips barely moving as he whispered to a colleague, "That's not denial. That's evasion." At the far right end of the panel, a moderate senator, known for never raising his voice, exhaled audibly and said, not to anyone in particular, but loud enough to be heard, "If you don't recall, you don't rebut." The words weren't intended as a dagger, but they landed like one. Bondi's expression didn't change, but her composure was thinning. For the first time all day, she blinked longer than she meant to. A tell. Her jaw shifted, a twitch beneath the skin, as if trying to clamp something down before it slipped. Her hands, once neatly folded, now moved, fingernails tapping slowly against the polished wood of the table. Not nervousness, but containment. And then it happened. The cameras caught her glance away. Not toward the committee, not toward Jasmine, but toward the floor, just for a second, but long enough. The kind of glance you don't plan, the kind you make when the mask slips. Across the room, journalists who had gone quiet during the weight of the previous evidence now began scribbling furiously. The narrative was writing itself in real time, and Bondi, once the master of sound bites and spin, had just surrendered control of the story. No one said her name, but every face in that room knew what was happening. Not just a political stumble, but a credibility fracture, a shift in posture, a shrinking. The chairwoman cleared her throat softly, perhaps to reset the air, perhaps out of habit. But nothing reset. The air remained heavy, thick with things unspoken. The documents still sat where Jasmine had placed them, undisputed, untouched. And now the silence following Bondi's answer wasn't neutral. It was damning. Jasmine hadn't moved. She hadn't spoken. She didn't need to. Her silence was now a force in the room, one that had changed the very rules of engagement. What began as a battle of narratives had become something else entirely, a reckoning made of paper and restraint. Bondi's choice not to defend herself, to retreat into a five-word deflection, had confirmed more than any rebuttal might have denied. Even her allies didn't look at her. They looked at their notes, or at nothing at all. And somewhere in that crowded, blinking chamber full of microphones, light panels and quiet power, a line had been crossed, not by volume, but by precision, not by attack, but by documentation, not by outrage, but by truth. And the woman they once tried to reduce to the angry one had never looked more composed, more deliberate, more undeniable. The silence left in the wake of Bondi's evasion didn't fade. It deepened, becoming a space Jasmine Crockett stepped back into, not to finish the fight, but to redefine its meaning. She returned to the microphone not with the sharp coolness that had anchored her earlier responses, but with something warmer, fuller, like the calm that follows a storm that didn't destroy, but revealed. Her fingers brushed the edge of the podium as if grounding herself in what had already been said, what had already been proven. The air was still electric, but now the charge came not from conflict, but from clarity. Her voice didn't need to rise to reclaim the moment. It had never left. When she spoke, it was with the kind of strength that doesn't command, it invites. It doesn't demand submission, it creates understanding. "If I walk out of this room today with nothing else," she began, her tone low but unwavering, "I will walk out knowing this. You thought angry was an insult." Her eyes swept the chamber, not accusing, not defensive, just steady. But today, angry became accountable. Angry became aware. Angry became the sound justice makes when it knocks at your door. The room froze, not in shock, not in resistance, but in recognition. It was the kind of stillness that doesn't ask what happens next, because it already knows something irreversible has occurred. The usual rustle of papers, the habitual tapping of pens, the click of cameras, gone. Replaced by silence so complete it seemed to carry its own gravity. A journalist in the front row, headset half slipped behind one ear, slowly removed it entirely. His eyes glistened, red around the edges, lips pressed tight. Not out of bias, but the kind of emotional reflex that comes from witnessing something no transcript could replicate. 2 rows back, a law clerk leaned forward as if gravity had pulled her there. She whispered something inaudible to the woman beside her, but her voice caught, and she didn't finish the sentence. And in the very back of the room, where interns and aides typically sat half engaged, a young black woman, no more than 22, pressed her hand to her mouth. Tears traced her cheeks before she could stop them. She wasn't crying because Jasmine had won. She was crying because Jasmine had survived and said the thing no one else ever could. Not just for herself, but for every woman who had ever been told to sit still and smile while the room took its shot. She wasn't watching history. She was watching permission. Permission to feel. Permission to rise. Permission to stay angry and still be right. Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't wait for reaction. She simply breathed, and in that breath the entire hearing room recalibrated. Not toward her, but because of her. Because one voice had shifted the center of gravity, not with outrage, but with truth sculpted into language that even silence could not ignore. She wasn't asking for approval. She wasn't performing for redemption. She was naming the moment. And once something has been named like that, in front of the record, the press, the nation, it cannot be unnamed. No vote had been cast, no ruling handed down, but something had already passed. Jasmine Crockett had taken a word designed to belittle her and redefined it as a national indictment, not just of Bondi, not just of the system, but of the culture that had allowed both to thrive unchecked. And in doing so, she did what no hearing, no ruling, no policy draft could achieve in real time. She made anger beautiful, useful, necessary. And by the end of that sentence, she had turned it into something sacred. The gavel never fell, but the silence did. And when the room finally exhaled, the hearing was over. But the reckoning had only just begun. The moment the chairwoman adjourned the session, the room broke, not into applause, but into motion. Staffers reached for briefcases, reporters stood and adjusted headsets, and aides filed out like chess pieces being reset. Pam Bondi rose first. Her face betrayed nothing, but her pace was just a touch faster than it had been that morning. She walked out through the grand double doors, past the marble pillars, and into a small crowd of waiting reporters. But something had changed. Microphones were pointed in her direction, but no one leaned forward. No one shouted questions. No one even made eye contact. The journalists glanced at one another, their silence almost polite, almost clinical. The red lights on the cameras were still blinking, but no one pressed forward. No headlines were chasing her now. What had once been her stage had become her shadow. She moved through the crowd like someone escaping a spotlight that no longer followed. Across the building, down a quieter hallway, lit only by soft natural light, Jasmine Crockett emerged through a side door, alone. There were no cameras waiting there, no staffers, no applause, just quiet. The kind of quiet that came not from absence, but from respect. She walked slowly, not because she was tired, but because the moment demanded it. Every step was still carrying the weight of what had just been said, not just in words, but in proof, in silence, in a truth too loud to ignore. Halfway down the corridor, she paused. A small figure stood ahead of her, arms tight around a cardboard sign. The girl couldn't have been older than 14. She wore a wrinkled school uniform and sneakers that had clearly seen too many seasons. Her braids were uneven, like they'd been done in a rush, and one of her socks had slid halfway down her ankle. But she stood tall, taller than she should have, taller than most adults would in the same moment. She held up the sign, both hands shaking slightly but never lowering it. "I'm the next angry one from Texas." The letters were hand-drawn, uneven but bold, black Sharpie on torn poster board. Jasmine stopped. She didn't say anything at first. She just looked at the girl's eyes, not wide with awe, but burning with something deeper, something that had already seen enough to understand what Jasmine had really done that morning, something that recognized a mirror, not a monument. Jasmine knelt slowly, carefully, until she was at the girl's eye level. The cameras had arrived now, quietly like shadows, clicking from a distance, unsure if they were intruding on something sacred. The girl didn't flinch. Jasmine reached forward, gently took her hand in both of hers and held it. Not as a politician, as something older than titles. As a woman who knew the cost of being heard. She smiled. Not big, not for show. Just enough. Then she leaned in and said, clear and low, "Then make sure they never silence you with your own voice." The girl nodded, her lips pressed together as if holding in the weight of that sentence. And Jasmine just held her gaze for a second longer before standing. She didn't pose for the cameras. She didn't address the press. She just walked, past the stone columns, past the manicured hedges, past a city still unsure of what it had just witnessed. But the cameras had caught it. One shot, Jasmine crouched, hand in hand with the girl, the sign held firmly between them like a baton passed in quiet fire. No angles, no filters, just truth. By sunrise the next morning, the image was everywhere. Front page of the New York Times, top trending on X, pinned to classroom doors across the South, framed in barbershops in East St. Louis, taped above water fountains in Houston public schools. The caption beneath the photo read simply, "The new face of anger and the future that follows." And for once, America didn't ask her to smile. It listened. The image had barely settled onto the front page of the New York Times before the backlash began. That morning, Jasmine Crockett awoke not to silence, but to war drums. Not from Congress, not from her district, but from television studios lit with rage and engineered panic. Across the country, pundits in navy suits and pearl earrings began circling her like hawks who'd spotted a woman refusing to bleed. The segment titles were blunt and coordinated. Is she angry or dangerous? Crockett's rhetoric, dividing or leading. When passion becomes a threat to order. On one network, a former senator stared into the camera and said, "She's not testifying. She's rallying. This isn't about justice, it's about fame." On another, a panel of commentators debated whether Jasmine had disrespected tradition by refusing to lower her tone. And just like that, they'd flipped the narrative. In less than 24 hours, the woman who had exposed documented injustice was being painted as a symbol of disorder. Her calm was framed as calculation. Her facts were called emotion. Her silence was cast as arrogance. And the word they had once whispered, angry, was now being screamed from every chyron. But Jasmine said nothing. She didn't tweet, didn't call a press conference, didn't return messages from sympathetic journalists begging for a quote. She simply walked into her office, closed the door, and sat down, alone. The walls were quiet, too quiet. Her staff had agreed not to come in unless she called. On her desk, the folders from the hearing remained open, untouched since the night before. She didn't move to organize them. Instead, she opened her laptop, went to a private streaming link, and rewatched the footage of her own testimony. Not out of vanity, out of discipline, out of memory, out of knowing what would come next. She watched as Bondi made her final remarks, clipped, cold, aimed like a thrown knife. She listened again to her own voice saying, "Angry became the sound justice makes when it knocks at your door." And for a moment, just a moment, she wondered if that was too much. Too poetic, too polished, too easy to twist. Because the twisting had already begun. 2 hours later, a leak hit the internet. It wasn't official, it wasn't verifiable, but it was enough. A screenshot of a 10-year-old email chain between Jasmine and an old college friend, sloppy, personal, full of late-night rants about professors and protest movements, was blasted across the political blogs like it was scripture. Exclusive. Crockett once called military recruitment in black schools targeted predation. Jasmine Crockett's radical college days. Was this always her plan? She didn't deny the email. Didn't need to. It was hers. She remembered writing it. She remembered crying while writing it. What she didn't remember was how it felt to see her pain treated like ammunition. Then came the knock. A senior staffer opened the door without waiting. Her face was pale, her hands trembling as she held out a phone. "You should see this." It was a video, spliced together from the hearing, cut up and reassembled, removing context, pacing, meaning. A popular YouTuber had uploaded it under the title, "Crockett Loses It on National Stage. Why She's Not Fit to Serve." The comments were worse. "She should be disbarred. She's the reason we don't trust women in power. This is what happens when you let activists wear suits." She scrolled, slowly, not out of shock, but out of recognition. This wasn't new. This was America's favorite sport. Build her up, watch her burn, pretend you're just reporting the fire. That night, her team sat in the conference room staring at a whiteboard full of media talking points. No one spoke. Even her chief of staff, usually quick with counter-messaging, stayed silent. Finally, one young aide, just out of law school, broke the quiet. "We can fight this," she said. "We can get CNN to clarify. We can push legal commentators to weigh in." Jasmine raised a hand, not to silence her, just to steady the room. She stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the DC skyline lit in amber fog. Then she said softly, "Let them say what they will. They're not building a story, they're revealing who they've always been." No one replied, because she was right. At 2:47 a.m., she received a text from an unknown number. No name, just a screenshot of her childhood home in Dallas, circled in red. The next text read, "Stay angry. We're watching." She stared at it for a full minute, then deleted it. Not out of fear, out of calculation. She knew what this was. She knew what came after disruption. They weren't trying to stop her. They were trying to scare her into silence. But that was the problem. She had already learned how to speak from silence. Now she knew how to speak into it. The next morning, she sat at her kitchen table, wrapped in an old college sweatshirt, sipping coffee from a chipped mug that said, "Defend the defenseless." She didn't turn on the news, didn't open her inbox. Instead, she opened a blank document and began to write. Title, "Anger is not the enemy." It wasn't a press release. It wasn't a statement. It was a manifesto. The manifesto was never meant to go viral. It began as a simple document, just Jasmine, in the early morning light, typing from her kitchen table in sweatpants and silence. The opening line was the only thing that came quickly. Anger is not the enemy. Apathy is. She didn't craft it like a speech. She wrote like someone trying to remember something that history kept trying to erase. Each paragraph carved deeper, into her fears, her fight, her years of restraint, her refusal to fold. It wasn't about Bondi anymore. It wasn't even about the hearing. It was about a lifetime of being told to smile while being ignored, and the moment she chose not to. She sent it to her chief of staff at 7:06 a.m., with no subject line, no edits, and no instructions. 2 hours later, it was online. By noon, it had 2.3 million reads. By 3 p.m., it was being quoted in classrooms, boardrooms, barbershops, and courtrooms. It wasn't just trending, it was resonating. In a high school in Southside Chicago, students who had been suspended the week before for organizing a walkout over the school's handling of a racist bullying incident taped Jasmine's photo to their lockers. A girl named Samira, barely 15, printed out a line from the manifesto and whispered it to herself before walking into a disciplinary meeting. They called me angry, but I was only awake. In a union hall in Pennsylvania, a group of factory workers paused their meeting when someone read the quote aloud. Anger without violence is not a threat, it's a reckoning. By the end of the day, they had voted to include Jasmine's words in their quarterly newsletter under the title Working While Black. In Georgia, something even stranger happened. A letter appeared in the Savannah Morning News, written by a woman who described herself as a lifelong conservative, mother of two, and retired military wife. It read, "I've voted red for 40 years. But this week I listened to a woman I was taught to fear and found myself instead feeling seen. Not because I agree with her politics, but because I know what it is to be called difficult for simply telling the truth." Jasmine Crockett reminded me that anger isn't what destroys this country. Silence is. The letter went viral on Facebook among suburban women's groups. Then it appeared on CNN's evening coverage. Then Fox News tried to mock it, only to have the clip shared again and again under the caption, "They didn't laugh because it was funny. They laughed because they were scared." But not all responses were words. In Detroit, a muralist began painting Jasmine's profile, serious, determined, lit from below, in the center of a crumbling brick wall once covered in gang tags. He called it "the voice that didn't blink." In Houston, the local library's Teen Leadership Council held an open mic night titled Still Angry, where students could read poems about injustice in their lives. One girl ended her piece with Jasmine's exact words, "Make sure they never silence you with your own voice." The room stood in silence after. Not because they didn't know what to say, but because they understood. The shift wasn't just cultural, it became institutional. 3 days after the manifesto dropped, the House Ethics Committee announced an inquiry into Pam Bondi's past conduct. The evidence submitted by Jasmine, once treated as courtroom theatrics, was now the basis of a bipartisan investigation. Bondi's staff tried to downplay it as political theater. But when former prosecutors and state-level attorneys came forward validating the documents Jasmine had introduced, the narrative cracked. That same day, a group of first-year law students at New York University launched a petition demanding ethics reform in how former state attorneys interact with federal power. Within 48 hours, it had 87,000 signatures. Not just students, not just progressives, but retired judges, civil engineers, veterans. This wasn't outrage. It was organization. And it had Jasmine's name under every wave of it. In an MSNBC interview, a professor of constitutional law put it best. We've seen hearings before, but what happened last week wasn't just testimony, it was reclamation. Jasmine Crockett didn't just hold her own, she held a mirror up to the system, and it blinked. But Jasmine didn't appear on camera. She declined every interview. She turned down 4 Sunday shows, 5 feature pieces, and even Oprah. She didn't speak, not because she was hiding, but because the country was finally speaking for itself. Instead, she walked into a 3rd-grade classroom in Southeast Dallas, no cameras, no press, and read aloud March Book 1 by John Lewis. She sat cross-legged on the floor with 10 students in uniforms that barely fit and asked them, "What does courage sound like?" A boy raised his hand. "It sounds like someone not yelling, but still shaking the room." Jasmine smiled. She didn't correct him, because he was right. That night, while walking to her car alone in the dark parking garage beneath the Capitol, Jasmine's phone vibrated. One new voicemail. Blocked number. She pressed play. A low voice came through the speaker. Male. Calm. Southern. Measured. "I didn't like what you said, but you said it like you meant it, and I respect that. Doesn't mean I'll vote with you, but I won't vote against you just because I'm supposed to. That's new. Don't waste it." Click. She stood still for a moment, the quiet of the garage stretching around her. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't praise. It was something far rarer in Washington. Respect. She didn't smile. She didn't relax. But she walked to her car a little taller. 1 year later, the room looked different, but Jasmine Crockett recognized every inch of it. It had once been a gymnasium, cracked linoleum floors, faded yellow lines from long-abandoned basketball tournaments. But now it was something else. The bleachers had been replaced with folding chairs, the scoreboard with framed newspaper front pages, and the old fluorescent lights with soft, warm overheads that made even the bare concrete walls feel human. And hanging at the very center of the stage was a single banner. It wasn't digitally printed. It was painted by hand. Each letter brushed in thick, uneven strokes that gave it weight. That gave it story. That gave it permanence. The Angry Room, dedicated to those who speak even when told to be silent. Jasmine stood in the back as the audience began to file in. She wasn't wearing a suit, no staff, no press pass, just a dark green blouse, worn jeans, and a lanyard that said guest. She didn't want to sit in the front row. She wasn't here to be honored. She was here to listen. The principal of Houston's Frederick Douglass High School stepped to the podium. He was a quiet man, one of the few in the city who had never sought political attention for his school's transformation. But today his voice carried. "We don't build legacy in bronze anymore," he said. "We build it in rooms like this, with words, with history, with names that weren't supposed to matter, and now matter more than anything." Behind him, the student choir sat in crisp white shirts, nervously clutching sheet music. The front row of chairs was lined with parents, some holding babies, others clasping the hands of children who had written poems for the event. And then she saw her, row 3, left side, same fire in her eyes, the girl from the hearing. But she wasn't a girl anymore. Not really. Her hair was longer now, pulled back in a tight ponytail. Her blazer didn't quite fit across the shoulders. It was borrowed, maybe from a cousin or a neighbor. But she wore it like armor. She stood when they called her name. Maya Johnson, 9th grade, student council president. The room fell quiet. She walked to the mic, unfolded a single sheet of paper, and took a breath so deep it seemed to steady the entire building. Then she began. "1 year ago, I stood outside a courthouse, holding a sign no one expected to be remembered. It said, 'I'm the next angry one from Texas.' I didn't know if anyone would notice. I didn't know if it mattered. But it did, because that moment, quiet, unfilmed except by a stranger's lens, was the first time I believed that anger wasn't something I had to apologize for. It could be something I carried, something I grew with, something I led with." She paused. just for a second. Her voice didn't shake. She looked out into the crowd and found Jasmine. Their eyes met. The room didn't notice, but both of them did. Maya smiled and continued. Today we open the angry room not as a protest space, but as a promise space. A room where debate isn't a threat, where honesty isn't punished, where emotion isn't weakness. This room isn't here to comfort power. It's here to challenge it. The applause was slow at first, not because people were hesitant, but because they were still absorbing what they'd heard. By the time the standing ovation came, Jasmine hadn't moved. She stayed in her seat, hands folded, chest still. She didn't need to rise. She'd already risen once, and now someone else had taken the mic. Later after the event, Jasmine slipped toward the exit quietly. She almost made it, until Maya caught her at the back hallway. "Miss Crockett," the girl said out of breath. "Wait." Jasmine turned. "It's just Jasmine today." Maya beamed, but her face turned serious almost immediately. "They want me to speak in D.C. next month. Teen Policy Roundtable, Congressional Youth Forum." Jasmine raised an eyebrow. "They're ready for that?" "No," Maya said, "but I am." They stood in silence for a moment. No cameras, no speeches. Just a moment between two people who had nothing left to prove, but everything left to protect. Then Maya pulled something from her pocket, a worn, folded piece of paper. It was the sign, the same cardboard she had held that day. The words were faded, but still visible. "I'm the next angry one from Texas." Maya handed it to Jasmine. "I thought maybe you should have this." Jasmine didn't take it. She smiled. "I think you're already doing just fine with it." Weeks later, back in Washington, a group of freshman representatives met behind closed doors, mostly quiet staffers, new faces, all young, all driven. On the whiteboard, someone had written in red ink, "Stay angry, stay ready." In the corner of the room sat a framed photo, not of the hearing, not of the documents, but of Jasmine crouched beside Maya, hand in hand, in front of the poster board sign. There was no caption. It didn't need one, because legacy didn't need to be explained anymore. It wore her name, and it had learned how to speak. Long after the hearings ended, after the headlines faded and the murals dried, what remained wasn't just a memory. It was a lesson carved into the conscience of a country still learning how to listen. The story of Jasmine Crockett wasn't just about a courtroom, a camera, or a confrontation. It was about a fault line that runs beneath every institution that calls itself free. It was about what happens when a woman dares to speak without shrinking, when she chooses evidence over appeasement and fury over forgetting. It was about the cost of telling the truth in a room designed to erase it with applause. And yet, she spoke. And when they tried to bury her voice beneath labels like angry, she didn't disprove them, she redefined them. Her defiance wasn't in volume but in presence. Her strength didn't come from power, but from precision. She didn't beg for respect. She built it, one calm word at a time, until the silence cracked and the system had to look at itself. Not in protest, in reflection. Because here's the truth that carried through every quiet moment of that hearing, through every click of the cameras, through every breath that held back tears. Anger is not the enemy. Injustice is. And when anger speaks not in chaos, but in clarity, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes history. It becomes accountability. And in Jasmine's case, it became a weapon forged not in fury, but in restraint. Her story reminds us that being underestimated is not a weakness. It's an opportunity. And being targeted is not failure. It's evidence that your voice reached the places they hoped it wouldn't. What Jasmine Crockett stood for cannot be confined to a transcript. It cannot be edited down into a news clip or filtered through commentary. What she did was remind an entire generation that you do not have to sacrifice your fire to be taken seriously. You do not have to smile to be heard. And you do not need permission to defend the truth when the truth is under attack. She showed us that legacy is not something you inherit. It's something you fight to leave behind. In every room that tried to silence you, in every name they tried to twist against you, in every moment you chose to speak anyway. So if you remember anything, remember this. When power calls your voice a threat, speak louder. When they call your strength unbecoming, stand straighter. And when they call you angry, tell them yes, you are, and you will stay that way until justice no longer has to beg for a seat at the table. And that's not a weakness. That's a beginning. But stories like Jasmine's aren't meant to end on a page or fade with applause. They're meant to wake something in us, something that refuses to sit still. So now it's your turn. Your turn to ask yourself what you would have done in that room. Would you have sat in silence while they misused her name? Would you have glanced away as the truth was buried under political theater? Or would you have stood, not with volume, but with courage, and demanded that justice no longer whisper in corners? Because Jasmine didn't speak for herself alone. She spoke for every voice ignored, every story twisted, every truth choked off by systems built to outlast resistance. But she proved they don't. She proved they fall when we rise. So if her story lit even a flicker in you, don't let it fade. Don't scroll past it. Don't file it away as just another headline. Carry it. Let it pull you to your feet. Start where you are. Maybe you're a teacher in a classroom where students are told to be quiet when they speak with conviction. Let them speak. Show them Jasmine's story. Let them write their own. Maybe you're a parent raising a child who's been told they're too loud, too bold, too much. Tell them that's power. Tell them the world changes when people dare to be too much. Maybe you work in a boardroom, a break room, or behind a desk, where injustice wears a tie and hides behind policy. Call it out. One voice in one meeting can echo far beyond the walls you're trapped in. Maybe you've never spoken up because you thought you didn't have the right words. But you don't need perfect words. You need your voice, steady and unafraid, because silence is the safest ally injustice ever had. And Jasmine proved how quickly it crumbles when one person decides not to be quiet. So read the documents, share the footage, teach the testimony, quote her in places that forgot how truth sounds, paint her name where the walls have gone blank, write letters, march when you have to, vote like your silence is a weapon and you refuse to hand it to them. And above all, when someone tells you you're angry, tell them you have every right to be. Because what Jasmine Crockett showed us wasn't how to win a hearing. She showed us how to build a reckoning and how to make it louder than the people trying to outlive it. This isn't a tribute. It's an invitation. Be the next angry one, and make sure they never silence you with your own voice. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.